The Texas Railroad Commission. The Texas Railroad Commission consists of 3 members elected in statewide elections for 6-year terms. It was created in 1891 to regulate railroads and later given regulatory authority over terminals, wharves, and express companies. In the 1920s, the Railroad Commission began regulating the exploration, drilling, and production of oil and natural gas, which is the Commission's primary function today. The Railroad Commission must approve the rates that local natural gas companies can charge and also regulates the safety of natural gas systems. The Texas Railroad Commission is the state agency that regulates the oil and gas industry, gas utilities, pipeline safety, safety in the liquefied petroleum gas industry, and surface coal and uranium mining. It has an annual budget of $79 million, and it now focuses entirely on oil, gas, mining, propane, and pipelines, setting allocations for production each month. The Commission was established by the Texas Legislature in 1891. It is the oldest regulatory agency in Texas. From the 1930s to the 1960s, it largely set world oil prices, until it was displaced by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, after 1973. In 1984, the federal government took over transportation regulation for railroads, trucking, and buses, but the Railroad Commission kept its name. In 2005, the rail oversight functions of the Railroad Commission were transferred to the Texas Department of Transportation. In 2013, a bill to reform the agency and change its name failed in the Texas legislature. There are 3 commissioners. These are elected officials who serve overlapping 6-year terms, and they're elected in statewide votes. No specific seat is designated as chairman. The commissioners choose the chairman from among themselves. The current commissioners are Christy Craddock, Wayne Christian, and Jim Wright. Texas voters ratified an amendment to the Constitution providing for a railroad commission in 1890. James Hogg was elected governor in 1890 with a plan to create a railroad commission to oversee regulation of the industry. In 1891, the legislature passed legislation that constitutionally created the Railroad Commission of Texas. The Texas legislature gave the Railroad Commission jurisdiction over operations of railroads, terminals, wharves, and express companies. It could set rates, issue rules on how to classify freight, require adequate railroad reports, and prohibit and punish discrimination and extortion by corporations. John H. Reagan was the first head of the Texas Railroad Commission, and he ran the organization between 1891 and 1903. He was the most outspoken advocate in Congress of bills to regulate railroads in the 1880s. He feared the corruption caused by railroad monopolies and considered their control a moral challenge. He believed that the agency should pursue 2 main goals: to protect consumers from unfair railway practices and excessive rates, and to support the state's overall economic growth. He focused the TRC on the collection of data, direct negotiation with railway executives, and compromises with the parties involved. Under Reagan's guidance, freight rates declined dramatically. In 1891, a typical freight was 1.403 cents per ton mile. By 1907, the rate was 1.039 cents, a decline of 25%. At the same time, though, the Texas railway system began a slow decline. The railroads did not have rates high enough for them to upgrade their equipment and lower costs in the face of competition from pipelines, cars, and trucks. From the 1890s through the 1960s, the Texas Railroad Commission found it difficult to fully enforce Jim Crow segregation legislation. Because of the expense involved, Texas railroads often allowed wealthier blacks to mix with whites rather than provide separate cars, dining facilities, and even depots. West Texas authorities often refused to enforce Jim Crow laws because few African Americans resided there. In the 1940s, the Railroad Commission's enforcement of segregation laws began collapsing further, in part because of the great number of African American soldiers that were transported during World War II. The trains were integrated in the early 1960s. The Railroad Commission's reach expanded as it took over responsibility for regulating oil pipelines in 1917, oil and gas production in 1919, natural gas delivery systems in 1920, bus lines in 1927, trucking in 1929, and it grew from 12 employees in 1916 to 69 in 1930 and 566 in 1939. In the early 1930s, the global price of crude oil dropped dramatically. At that time, production from East Texas oil fields was unrestrained. East Texas oil prices plunged to 25 cents a barrel. The traditional Railroad Commission policy of negotiating compromises failed. The governor was forced to call in the state militia to enforce order. Texas oil men preferred state to federal regulation and wanted the TRC, the Texas Railroad Commission, to set quotas so producers would get higher prices and profits. The Railroad Commission began to set the rate at which every oil well in Texas might produce, a process known as proration. By limiting production in East Texas and elsewhere, commissioners succeeded both in supporting oil prices and in conserving the state's resources. Ernest O. Thompson was the head of the Railroad Commission from 1932 to 1965. He took charge of the agency and indeed the world oil industry by appealing to an ideal of Texas's role in the global oil order. He cajoled, harangued, and browbeat recalcitrant producers into compliance with the TRC's pro-rationing orders. As late as the 1950s, the TRC controlled over 40% of United States crude production and approximately half of estimated national proved reserves. It served as a model in the creation of OPEC. In 1975, the Texas Surface Mining and Reclamation Act authorized the Commission to regulate the exploration and surface mining of coal, lignite, and uranium within the state, and to oversee the reclamation of lands disturbed by the surface mining operations. By the early 1990s, the Railroad Commission consisted of 4 regulatory divisions: oil and gas, transportation and gas utilities, surface mining and reclamation, and liquefied petroleum gas. In 2005, the Rail Division and its remaining function, Rail Safety Regulation, were transferred to the Texas Department of Transportation. And the Railroad Commission has had no railroad-related functions since that time. A modern issue with which the Railroad Commission is concerned is the controversy over fracking. On February 1st, 2012, the Railroad Commission implemented the Hydraulic Fracturing Disclosure Rule, one of the nation's first and most comprehensive rules for disclosure of chemical ingredients used in hydraulic fracturing fluids. Fracking is a common practice in the Permian Basin in Texas, the largest oil field in the country. An estimated 5 trillion liters were disposed of in the region between 1978 and 2016. Fracking is also claimed to produce or cause seismic activity. When fluid is injected at such a high pressure, so deep, sometimes miles into the ground, it runs the risk of hitting a fault line, counteracting existing friction between tectonic plates and spurring on a quake. In Oklahoma, the State Geological Survey tied a 900-fold increase in earthquakes between 2008 and 2019 to wastewater injection, a pattern that state seismologist Jake Walter said is unprecedented in human history. In 2009 and 2010, researchers at SMU linked a string of earthquakes in Cleburne, Texas, to the injection of fracking wastewater underground after installing sensors near fault lines and pinpointing injection wells near the epicenter of a number of quakes. The authors reported the same trend around a wave of earthquakes a few years later between 2013 and 2014 in Azle, Texas, 50 miles to the north. This is a notice to oil and gas operators in the Gardendale district in North Texas, or West Texas. Since February 2020, it says, 6 felt earthquakes of magnitude 3.5 or greater have occurred in an area of the Midland Basin from northeast Ector County to southwest Martin County, known as the Gardendale Seismic Response Area. These include a M3.7 earthquake in southwestern Martin County, about 8 miles northwest of Midland, on September 7, 2021, and 2 M3.6 earthquakes northeast of Odessa in February 2020 and May 2021. The Railroad Commission of Texas has authority to regulate saltwater disposal well activity and may exercise that authority to address seismic activity. The RRC staff's analysis of available information has determined that SWD in saltwater disposal, that is, injection, likely contributes to seismic activity in the Gardendale SRA. Therefore, the RRC has requested that operators in the Gardendale SRA reduce saltwater disposal activity as a means of altering conditions likely contributing to seismic activity. The RRC anticipates these procedures to be in place for at least a year from initiation. The RRC has identified 76 permitted SWD wells in the Gardendale SRA, and the operators of those wells are being notified in writing of this request. TRC said it would not permit disposal wells around Midland in the northwest region of Texas because of earthquakes until further notice. The agency requested that 76 existing wells reduce their daily injection of volumes and ordered that permitted wells that aren't yet in service refrain from starting injection. The announcement came the same day as a 3.3 magnitude quake 36 miles north of Midland.